"Please, don't lift my skirt," she whispered, her voice cracked with soot and shame, though the wind was the only one to hear it. Her hands trembled around the burned edges of the wool, fingers curling instinctively as if she could hide the ruin of her legs from the world forever. The hem was blackened, crusted with ash, still smoldering in patches from the fire that had eaten her life whole. Smoke clung to her skin like a second death. Her name was Elara, though no one had spoken it in days, not since the raid, not since the cabin burned, not since the man she called husband shoved her toward the edge of the woods and said, "You'll distract them. Run." She ran. And now she knelt in the snow, alone, skirts scorched, breath coming in bursts, eyes wide and refusing to cry. But someone else stood before her. Someone who didn't move like the men who'd laughed as her home turned to cinders. He was taller than the trees behind him, shoulders wide and unthreatening, eyes the color of riverbed stone. Apache. She had feared this, had been taught to, but the man didn't speak. He didn't reach, he didn't lift. He knelt, lowering himself like the sun does in reverence to dusk, and laid a thick, woven blanket across the snow before her. Not on her, not over her, before her. A choice, not a command. His name, she'd learn later, was Nawat. But now he was only a silhouette against white wind, his bare forearms lined with tiny burn scars of his own, his breath visible and calm. She flinched when his fingers touched the earth instead of her. He dragged the blanket closer. Not enough to touch her, just enough to say, "Warmth is near if you want it." Her fingers relaxed a little, not because she trusted him, but because the wind had turned crueler than fire, and something inside her, a flicker still alive, chose not to die here. "Why?" she rasped. One word, more breath than voice. He tilted his head but said nothing. She realized then that maybe he couldn't speak, or didn't choose to, or maybe this was just how men should be when a woman trembles. He reached into his belt pouch and pulled something small, a twist of salt wrapped in cloth. He set it beside the blanket. Salt, she remembered vaguely, was sacred to his people. She stared. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, hadn't swallowed hope in longer. Still kneeling, she reached with the tips of 2 fingers, dragging the blanket toward her knees, then over them, hiding the scorched wool. She didn't pull it higher. Not yet. But her hand stopped shaking. The man didn't smile. He just waited. Her lips parted again. "They said you'd hurt me," she said. "They said you'd take me if you found me like this." She expected him to walk away, to vanish into the woods now that her shame was laid bare. But he remained. Still. Steady. Then, so slowly, he touched his own chest and tapped the ground. A gesture. She didn't understand. She would. Later. For now it only meant, "I am here, and I will not take." The wind howled louder, but the silence between them was louder still, and warmer. The salt hit her tongue like a forgotten prayer. Elara hadn't realized how long it had been since she'd tasted anything that wasn't smoke or fear. The tiny cloth parcel sat open beside her knee, the last flecks of the sacred mineral sticking to the fabric, as if they, too, were afraid to vanish. She swallowed slowly, the way someone does when trying not to weep, and looked up. He hadn't moved. Nawat still knelt across from her, his massive frame more silent than the trees, more certain than the wind. The morning light caught the sharp line of his cheekbone and the softness in his eyes. 2 truths that shouldn't have lived together on the same man. Her breath fogged the air between them. "Thank you," she whispered. He dipped his head just once, the way men did when acknowledging something delicate but real. The blanket still covered her legs, but she hadn't lifted it higher. Not yet. The shame of being found like that, burned, dirty, skirt singed up past her knees, still clung to her skin tighter than the frost. But the way he looked at her, it was as if he saw none of it, as if what he noticed was not the ash, but the fact she was still here. "They said Apache warriors don't forgive white women," she said softly, not out of accusation, but memory. "They said if I ever ended up in your woods, I wouldn't return." She hadn't meant it to sound like a question, but he treated it like one. His hand moved slowly, drawing a circle in the snow between them with one finger. Then he pointed to the eastern sky and tapped his chest. Elara blinked, trying to understand. "You follow the sun," she guessed. He shook his head, tapped his chest again, then hers, slowly, deliberately. Understanding bloomed in her chest before her mind caught up. Not the sun, the same fire. She glanced down at the scorched wool clinging to her calves. The fire that had destroyed everything she knew had also brought her here, to this man who didn't speak, didn't grab, didn't demand, just gave. She pulled the blanket a little higher, not from shame but because her body had started to feel again, and the cold was sharper than she'd realized. Her fingers brushed the edge of her thigh. Raw, blistered, healing. He saw the wince but didn't flinch. Didn't pity. Instead, he turned slightly and opened the leather pouch at his side, retrieving a small jar wrapped in hide. He placed it in the snow and nudged it toward her with the back of his hand. "Salve." She didn't reach for it. Not yet. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Do you want something?" For the first time, his gaze dropped. Not in shame, but in reflection. He picked up a small stick and began to draw in the snow. A triangle, then another, wider one around it. Elara watched as he pressed his thumb to the center. "What is it?" she asked. He pointed to the mark, and then to her heart. Then to his. She didn't understand. Not fully. But something told her that this was not a transaction. This was not survival. This was ceremony. She touched the jar of salve, but didn't open it. Instead, she said, "You can stay, if you want." His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes softened. She would never know the weight of what that permission meant to a man who had only been feared. But she would learn. That night, she dreamed of a forest that never burned, and a boy who carved wolves into wood just to keep them from loneliness. Elara stirred beneath the hide blanket, the warmth unfamiliar, almost false, until she opened her eyes and saw the cabin again, small and half-buried in snow but safe, sealed, whole. She blinked slowly. The roof no longer dripped. The fire had died down to a warm glow in the stone hearth, and her body, aching and stiff, was still wrapped in the same blanket he'd laid over her. But it wasn't the warmth that made her sit up. It was the scent. Smoke. Not from the fire, but from her hair. Her fingers reached up and touched the brittle strands. Still tangled, still singed. She hadn't noticed how deeply the ash had woven into her until now. It clung like guilt. And suddenly she was back there again, in the screaming, in the flames, in the sound of men on horses yelling, "Let her burn." Her breath caught, and she clenched her fists into the wool. Then she heard it. A sound. Carving. Nawat sat by the window, his back to her, whittling a thin piece of cedar with slow, reverent strokes. The rhythm calmed her before she even meant to be calmed. She watched him for a long moment. He had taken off his outer wrap, now just in the sleeveless leather and the soft, raw hide that clung to his shoulders. His braid lay heavy down his back, steady as a river. For a man who could break logs with his hands, he moved with care so precise it made her chest ache. She stood slowly, and her knees nearly buckled from the pain, but she gritted her teeth and steadied herself. He turned at the sound, and rose in one smooth motion. She lifted a hand. "I'm all right," she said. "Just stiff." He didn't argue. Just waited. She moved to the small basin near the fire and poured water from the jug beside it. Her fingers hovered. Her reflection in the water wasn't one she recognized. Smoke-shadowed eyes. Burned lips. A woman who had lost too much to count. She dipped her hands in, flinched at the cold, and began to scrub. The smoke didn't want to leave. It clung to her scalp, to her skin, like a second soul. She bit her lip hard, wincing as the tears threatened. Then she felt it. Movement behind her. A presence. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. But slowly he knelt beside the basin and dipped another cloth. Warmed it first in the steam, then held it out to her. Not pushing. Not taking. Just offering. Ilara reached for it, but her fingers trembled. He gently placed the cloth in her palm, then waited. She pressed it to her neck. His eyes flicked to the edge of her singed braid. Then he reached forward and, with a slowness that could only come from reverence, took a strand in his hand. She froze. But he didn't cut, didn't pull. He just held it, rolled it between his fingers and let it fall. Then he took another and began to weave. 3 strands. A slow, careful braid. She didn't stop him. Didn't move. Just let him. The silence between them wasn't hollow. It was holy. When he tied the end with a thin strip of leather, she looked down at the steam rising from the basin and whispered, "They never saw me like this." He didn't answer. He didn't have to, because the way he'd braided her hair said it all. He did. By morning, the snow had swallowed their footprints entirely, as if the earth itself had chosen to forget the path that brought her here. Ilara sat quietly on the edge of the woven mat, legs curled beneath her, staring at the door Nawat had just closed behind him. He'd said nothing as he left, only met her eyes, nodded once, and slipped out with a knife at his hip and a woven satchel slung across his back. But his silence wasn't the cold kind. It was the kind that told her, "You're safe enough for me to step away." She ran her fingers through the single braid he'd made last night. It felt heavier today, like it held meaning she wasn't ready to name. She rose slowly, bones still sore but steadier than yesterday. A rush of cold slipped in through a gap in the wall, and she tucked the hide blanket tighter around her shoulders, moving to the fire. It had burned low, but she fed it carefully, just like he'd shown her. The kindling caught with a stubborn flicker, then roared to life like it wanted to prove her worth. She smiled. First time in days, maybe weeks. When the cabin filled with heat again, she scanned the room. Every surface told her something about him. The careful arrangement of dried herbs, the carved hooks by the door, each smoothed by years of use, the thick hide draped over the sleeping mat, patched but clean, and beside the hearth, a small stool with half-finished wood carvings. She picked one up, a wolf mid-snarl, teeth detailed, eyes almost mournful. Not savage, but wounded. Like him. Like her. Then her eyes landed on the leather pouch near the window. She hadn't noticed it before. Curiosity nudged her. Carefully, she opened it, and inside were 3 things: a polished stone shaped like a raindrop, a worn piece of cloth with Lakota beadwork, and a folded scrap of paper. Her breath caught. She unfolded the paper slowly, afraid it might crumble. The writing was in English, sharp and angular. It read, "He carried her through fire. If you find this and she's alive, he kept his word." Ilara's chest tightened. Was it about her? Someone else? Or was that the past he never spoke of? She placed everything back exactly as it was and turned to the window. Outside, she saw his shape returning through the trees, slow but purposeful. He carried a bundle of kindling and something slung over his shoulder, rabbit or fox, maybe. But that wasn't what gripped her. It was the trail behind him. There wasn't one. No broken snow, no drag marks, no footprints. It was like he floated, or like he doubled back to erase every step. She watched as he neared the cabin and brushed snow from his shoulders before stepping in. He glanced at her face, then at the pouch by the window. Saw it had been moved. She opened her mouth to explain, but he held up a hand, not angry, just tired. "You're here now," he said simply, and moved past her to begin skinning the animal. She knelt beside him without asking and picked up the knife he laid out. He paused, then let her help. They worked in silence, side by side, steam rising from the pot as the meat hit the broth. As the sun dipped again toward dusk, she finally spoke. "Why erase your steps?" He didn't look up. "Snow tells stories." She blinked. "And you don't want anyone to read yours?" He shook his head. "Not mine. Yours." She swallowed hard. He'd covered her trail, not to hide himself, but to protect the woman the world had thrown away. The world might have wanted her gone, but Nawat had left no trace for it to follow. That night, Ilara could not sleep. Not from fear anymore, but from the weight of a warmth she didn't know how to carry. The fire crackled low at the center of the cabin, and though Nawat had already laid down across the room with his back to her, his breathing was steady, untroubled, as if he had long made peace with silence. She lay on her side, watching the orange light flicker across the carved beams overhead, fingers curled loosely in the hem of the blanket he'd left her. It smelled faintly of smoke and cedar, and something that made her chest ache, something that reminded her she had once believed in safety. Slowly, without thinking, she sat up. Her feet touched the earth floor, still cool but no longer cruel, and she walked barefoot to the hearth, feeding the fire with care. Then she did something strange. She reached for the second bowl, the one he always left untouched, and filled it with stew. She set it gently on the other side of the fire. Not to wake him, not to offer. Just to say, "I see what you do. I see that you see me." Minutes passed. She returned to her mat and tucked herself in. But before she could close her eyes, she heard it. A quiet shifting of weight, then the soft clink of the wooden spoon against the bowl. He was eating. Not ravenously, not out of hunger, but like it mattered that she had given it. The quiet that followed was thicker than before, but gentler, too. When dawn came, she woke to find a folded square of cloth at the foot of her blanket. A new skirt, sewn by hand. Not fancy, just whole. The hem was double-stitched where hers had frayed. She held it in trembling hands, knowing he must have worked on it while she slept. She stood, holding it against her waist. Then she looked at the door, where he now stood, backlit by morning light, his shoulders bare beneath the leather strap across his chest. He didn't smile, didn't step forward. He just said, "You can have your name back whenever you want it." She blinked. "My name?" "You haven't said it once," he murmured. "Not to me, not to the fire, not even to yourself." Her throat caught. "Ilara," she whispered. "My name is Ilara." He nodded. Then the snow didn't win. The weight of those words sat between them, heavier than any silence yet. She looked down again at the skirt, then up at him. "Why this?" she asked. "Why the skirt? Why the fire? Why not just leave me?" He didn't answer right away. He stepped to the side, reached behind the firewood stack, and pulled out a piece of wood she hadn't seen before. It was small, shaped like a woman seated cross-legged, head bowed, skirt torn. But beside her, a second carving. Same woman, same posture, but this time with a flame between her hands. "I've been carving you since the first night," he said. "I wasn't sure if it was hope or foolishness, but I didn't want you to disappear without someone remembering you right." Her eyes blurred. Not with fear, not with grief, but with the realization that someone had noticed. Someone had seen her even when she hadn't seen herself. She walked to him, slowly, holding the skirt in both hands. He didn't move. When she reached him, she offered it back. "Sew it onto me," she said quietly. "Not because I need it, but because it's the first thing that was ever made for me without a price." He took it, nodded once, and motioned for her to sit. She did. And as the fire crackled behind them, Nawat knelt, thread in hand, and stitched hope back into a woman the world thought was broken. The next evening, snow whispered softly against the roof, as if the storm outside had tired of its rage, and now only wanted to be heard. Inside the cabin, Elara sat beside the fire, her newly mended skirt draped over her knees, the fabric still stiff where Nawat had sewn it back together. She hadn't said much since the stitching, but something inside her had changed. Her hands no longer shook when she held a cup. Her eyes met his a little longer when he spoke. Tonight he placed a thick woven blanket between them, as he did every night, his silent way of drawing the line that kept her dignity intact. He always slept on one side of the fire, and she on the other, and not once had he crossed that invisible boundary. But tonight, as the wind howled outside and the warmth of the stew settled into her chest, Elara looked at the blanket and whispered, "What if I don't need the line anymore?" Nawat, seated on his mat polishing the edge of a carved wooden figure, paused. He didn't look up right away, but his fingers stilled. "It's not for you," he said. "It's for the girl who was dragged through the snow, the one who thought silence was safer than being seen." Elara exhaled slowly. "She's still here," she admitted, "but she's learning not to hide behind seams." He finally looked at her. "Then the line can stay until she tells me otherwise." For a long time, the only sound was the pop and crackle of the fire. Elara leaned back against the wall, pulling the blanket over her lap, this time not as a shield, but as a bridge. "Did you ever lose someone?" she asked. Nawat's gaze flickered to the carving in his hand. "A sister. Before the white sickness swept our camp. She used to braid my hair when I was little." He smiled faintly. "She said every knot was a promise to come back safe." Elara's voice softened. "You braid wood now." He nodded. "The knots are still promises, even if they're just for memory." She watched him for a while. There was something about the way he sat, grounded, unmoved by the storm, that made her feel as if her fear didn't need to be the loudest thing in the room anymore. "My mother used to sew," she said. "She made dresses with little bluebirds embroidered near the hem. Said if I ever got lost, the birds would remember the way home." Nawat's eyes glinted. "Then I'll carve you a bluebird," he said simply, "so you never forget again." Her throat tightened. "You don't owe me anything." "It's not a debt," he said. "It's just what people do when they care." That word landed with a quiet weight. Not love, not duty, but care. Simple, true, and freely given. Elara glanced down at her feet, the skin still pink and scarred, but no longer raw. "They gave me to you like I was nothing," she said, "and you keep handing me back to myself, piece by piece." Nawat didn't reply. Instead, he set aside the carving, moved to the fire, and stirred the pot. Then, wordlessly, he ladled 2 bowls and placed one across from her. No expectations, no commands, just space, just choice. She took it, ate in silence. And when it was time to sleep, she pulled the blanket not between them, but around them both, one corner tucked beneath her arm and the other draped gently across his shoulder. Nawat didn't move away. He only whispered, "We'll keep the fire burning together." And as the wind sighed outside, Elara let herself believe, for the first time in years, that warmth could be shared without fear. The morning sun poured into the cabin like a quiet blessing, melting the last chill from the corners and warming the place where the blanket still lay across their shoulders. Elara stirred before Nawat, her eyes drawn to the flickering light playing on the carved figures lined neatly on the shelf. She rose carefully, her feet still sensitive, but now strong enough to hold her steady, and walked toward them. There were bears, birds, and a small wolf, each shaped with patience, each bearing the touch of someone who remembered too much and spoke too little. Her fingers found a new one tucked beside the fire pit, still unfinished. A tiny bird, its wings mid-fold, its beak slightly open. Nawat must have worked on it after she fell asleep. The chest was rounded just enough to fit the dip of a thumb, like it had been carved to be held, not just seen. "You made this for me," she whispered. Nawat's voice answered behind her, soft and low. "I didn't finish it yet." She turned. He was already standing, already watching her, and something about the way he held her gaze made the silence feel more intimate than any word. "Bluebirds remember home," she said. "So my mother claimed," he replied. "And where is yours?" she asked. "You've carved so many places into these animals." Nawat stepped closer, then reached for the bird and cradled it in his calloused hands. "It used to be a camp at the base of a cliff, near a stream. My mother sang while she ground the corn, and my sister used to chase shadows across the rock face. That place is burned now. Soldiers came with torches and forgot we were people." Elara inhaled, slow and careful. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "I don't speak of it to be pitied, only to remind myself what should never be forgotten." Then he looked at her again and added, "We build new homes. Even if they're small, even if they start with just one room and a fire." She sat down, taking the bird back in her hand, tracing the curve of its neck. "When I left the town, I didn't think I'd ever find another home. I thought maybe I didn't deserve one." "They convinced you of that," he said. "Not the truth." Her throat clenched. "I let them." "You survived them," he corrected. "There's a difference." She blinked back the sting in her eyes, but one tear slid free and landed on the wood. Nawat moved without hesitation. He knelt beside her and took the carving from her palm. Then, pulling a strand of her hair gently between his fingers, he wrapped it once around the bird's neck, tying it with a loop so soft it barely held. "Now it's yours," he said, "not for remembering what they did, but for remembering who you are without them." Her lip trembled. "And who's that?" "The woman who walks barefoot through snow and still stands." He handed her the bird again, now carrying both wood and memory, and rose to stir the pot of food. She held it in her lap, for a long while, rocking slightly, the way one might with a child not yet asleep. Outside, the wind had stilled. The forest waited. And inside the cabin, a new shape began to form. Not carved from pine or stitched from cloth, but shaped in the air between them. A shape called belonging. The knock was not loud, but it struck through the cabin like a stone tossed in still water. Elara froze near the hearth, her hand tightening around the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew. Nawat stood instantly, his face unreadable, and motioned for her to stay back. When he opened the door, the wind pushed in with the scent of pine and something heavier: horses, sweat, leather. 3 men stood outside, one older with a gray-flecked beard and 2 younger behind him, both armed and grim-faced. "Didn't expect to find you all the way out here, Nawat," the elder said, his voice flat but familiar. Nawat gave a nod. "Kaito, your shadow is longer than I remember." The man let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "Word is, you've taken in a woman." Elara could barely see through the crack between the door and wall, but the tone made her blood run cold. Nawat didn't answer right away. She was left to die. Kato's eyes shifted slightly, peering past him into the cabin. "Still, a white woman? This close to patrol routes?" One of the younger men stepped forward. "They'll hang you for harboring her, brother or not." "They'd hang her first," Nawat replied, calm but unwavering, "which is why she's here, not theirs to harm again." Kaito rubbed his jaw and stepped aside. "We're not here to judge, but you need to know. Some trader from the settlement was bragging last night that he'd sold a body for silver, claimed she was trouble, said she screamed the whole way up." Elara's breath caught. Nawat turned just slightly, enough to let the men know he heard. "She's not for sale." Kaito glanced again past him. "She's marked, Nawat. If he talks too loud, others might come. You're not alone in these woods, and not everyone will ask questions first." Nawat's hand tightened around the doorframe. "I know." "Then why keep her?" Kaito asked. "Because someone should have, long before now." The older man studied him. Then, with a slow nod, he signaled to the others. "You've got until first snow. After that, I won't be able to stop what comes." "You never could," Nawat replied, not unkindly. The 3 turned and left, boots crunching against the dirt path, until only silence and pine sap wind remained. Nawat shut the door. Elara stood frozen by the fire. "Was that your brother?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "He was once." Nawat returned to the hearth and sat across from her, watching the flame. "They think I'm a fool." "Are you?" she asked, not mocking, just searching. "If protecting someone is foolish, then yes," he said. "But I've been alone a long time. My strength has nowhere to go unless I use it for something. Or someone." Elara's hands trembled as she ladled stew into a bowl. She brought it to him without a word, setting it gently in front of him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he took her hand, the same one that had once clutched her torn skirt in terror, and placed it on his chest. She could feel the steady rhythm beneath. "If they come," he said quietly, "I want you to remember this. You have a place here, not because I gave it to you, but because you stayed when it would have been easier to run." Her breath hitched. "What if I'm not strong enough?" "Then we'll be strong together." The wind shifted outside, lifting the edge of the smoke from the chimney, curling it upward into the growing dusk. Inside, she leaned forward, resting her forehead to his. "I won't run," she whispered. "Then neither will I," he replied. And the cabin, once so small and silent, seemed to grow walls strong enough to hold even the weight of what was coming. They came before the snow fell, not as a mob, not loud, but like rot beneath bark, slow, sure, and reeking of purpose. It began with the mule going missing, the tracks too neat to be a predator. Then a dead crow nailed to the cabin door. Nawat didn't speak of it, But Ilara saw how he slept with his knife now, how his eyes scanned the tree line longer each morning. When the cabin was empty of warmth one dawn, she found him outside, splitting wood not for fire but for stakes. Lean pieces sharpened to points, driven into the ground around the perimeter. "They'll try to scare you first," he said as he worked, sweat clinging to his temples despite the chill. "They think fear makes a woman easier to move." "It doesn't," she replied, carrying the kindling he'd chopped. "It makes her harder to break." That night, when the air stilled and the moon hung pale behind the clouds, Ilara heard something snap beyond the stakes. Nawat was already at the door, bow in hand, eyes like carved obsidian. "Stay inside," he ordered, but Ilara stepped beside him. "You said we're strong together." He looked at her for a beat, then nodded once. "Then don't speak, and don't flinch." The figures came out of the dark like smoke. 4 of them, faces masked in rags, clothes too clean for honest woodsmen. The first spoke. "You've got what's ours." Nawat didn't answer. The second man held up a silver coin. $3, we paid." Ilara's lip curled. "You paid for silence, and I'm done being quiet." That startled them. One shifted his stance. "She talks like she belongs here." "She does," Nawat said, "and you're trespassing." The man holding the coin stepped forward. "Last chance. We leave with the woman or we burn this place to the ground." Ilara stepped in front of Nawat, heart pounding. "Then light your match. But I won't go with you." The one with the coin snarled. "You're just a woman." "I was," she said, voice low, "until a giant gave me fire, shelter, and his name." The silence that followed cracked colder than frost. Then the third man lunged. Nawat moved like thunder, grabbing the attacker mid-stride and slamming him into the earth with a force that left snow dancing in the air. The others pulled back, uncertain now. "You were warned," Nawat said, voice like winter-breaking trees. "Leave, while you can still walk." One man dragged the groaning attacker back. The one with the coin spat at Ilara's feet. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, eyes like stone. "But you might." When they disappeared into the trees, Nawat collapsed to one knee, breath tight, shoulder bloodied from a slash she hadn't seen. Ilara rushed to him, tearing her apron into strips. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He gripped her wrist. "They took your body once. They won't take your spirit." She pressed against the wound, tears stinging her, cheeks. "You're hurt because of me." "I'm healed because of you," he whispered. "This place, this life, it didn't start until you stayed." Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and soundless, covering the bloody ground like a blessing. Inside, the fire crackled. She dressed his wounds with careful hands, then wrapped herself beside him on the floor. Not as a rescued woman, but as a keeper of their shared name, of their chosen beginning. The war wasn't over, but tonight they had not lost. And somewhere deep in the trees, the wolves howled, not in warning, but as witness. By morning, the sky above the cabin was blanketed in the softest gray, the kind that made sound feel hushed and sacred. Ilara woke with Nawat's arm still draped over her waist, his breath even now, his shoulder tightly wrapped in the bandages she'd changed twice in the night. She didn't move right away. She watched the fire's embers flicker low and thought of what hadn't been burned. The cabin still stood, her skin bore no new marks, and the man beside her had fought for her name, like it was his own. When he stirred, groaning softly, she touched his face. "You should rest more." "I will," he murmured, blinking at her. "After you eat." She smiled gently, then rose to stoke the fire and heat the rabbit stew she'd made from the last catch he'd set aside. As she worked, she noticed the small carvings he'd etched into the mantel above the hearth. Not of wolves or moons, but of her. Hair braided, arms lifting a bucket, eyes soft but steady. "You made these?" she asked, voice small. "I don't remember sitting still." He nodded. "I didn't carve you sitting still." She looked again. Each detail felt sacred, as if the image had been captured not with hands but with knowing. "Why?" He leaned his head back against the wall. "Because you stayed." That afternoon, he asked her to walk with him to the high ridge where the first sun always kissed the land. He carried no weapon. She took only a shawl. They walked in silence, the wind brushing their cheeks like an old lullaby. At the ridge, he took her hands. "I've known many winters, Ilara. I've seen what cold can do, but no storm ever frightened me like the idea of you leaving." She swallowed hard. "You think I would?" "No," he said. "But I need you to know, what we have here isn't survival. It's sanctuary." She touched his chest. "Then let's make it a life." He pulled a small, hand-woven necklace from his pocket, the kind his mother once wore. "This was made by my grandmother for the woman I would name." He looped it around her neck, not as a claim, but as a promise. Her breath caught. "What name?" "The one you choose, but the one I'll say is wife." She cried then, not out of sorrow, but out of being seen, and he let her cry, arms around her, steady and unyielding. When they walked back down, they did so slowly, no longer afraid of tracks in the snow. That night, she took her old dress, the one they had torn, stained and branded, and burned it in the fire. Nawat didn't ask why. He just handed her the wool shawl she'd woven herself and kissed the top of her head. When they lay down, there were 2 spoons on the table, 2 mugs, and a wooden carving of a woman kneeling beside a fire. Ilara, named, seen, loved. In the stillness of the dark, with her head resting on Nawat's shoulder and his fingers brushing gently against hers, she whispered, "I think I was always meant to walk here." "No," he whispered back. "You were meant to walk free. You just chose to walk to me." And in that small cabin, guarded by stakes and warmed by their joined breath, Ilara closed her eyes and finally slept. Not like someone who had been claimed, but like someone who had claimed herself. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Echoes of the West. If you had seen her trembling under that blanket, would you have walked away or stayed beside her like he did? Tell us in the comments.